The Carpathian Mountains had swallowed them whole. What started as a relaxing supernatural retreat had devolved into 7 days of supernatural hell, with each day bringing fresh humiliations and deeper animosity between the four immortal beings, who were discovering that eternity meant nothing when you couldn't find your way out of a forest. Harriet Blackthorne, a witch whose family lineage traced back to the Salem incidents, on the winning side of course, thank you very much, sat hunched over a pitiful collection of soggy twigs that refused to acknowledge her existence, let alone burst into flame. Her usual arsenal of fire spells, weather magic, and general reality bending had been reduced to the magical equivalent of a damp matchbook. Water dripped steadily from her once pristine auburn hair onto her designer hiking boots, boots that now looked like they'd been through a blender filled with mud and regret. "This is absolutely unconscionable," she declared, her cultured accent cracking with exhaustion. "I have commanded storms, Wesley. Commanded them. I once made it rain toads for 3 days straight, just because a village priest annoyed me at market. And now I can't even dry my own socks." Wesley Cromwell, a vampire who'd been alive since the Napoleonic Wars, but had somehow never learned basic survival skills, was currently upside down in a tree for the 4th time that day. His vintage military cape, a genuine antique from his human days, had become less mysterious creature of the night and more wet laundry that fought back. His usually perfect pale complexion was now decorated with scratches, mud, and what appeared to be bird droppings. "At least your powers are just dampened," he called down, trying to untangle himself with whatever dignity he had left. "My vampiric senses are completely blocked by this infernal pollen. Do you know what it's like to have a nose that can usually detect a paper cut from 3 miles away, suddenly unable to smell anything except wet werewolf?" "Hey," Vera Moonhowl snarled from across their pathetic excuse for a campsite. The werewolf was currently in her human form, but her supernatural strength meant that when she got angry, things tended to break. Unfortunately, in their current situation, breaking things only made their problems worse. She'd already snapped 2 potential shelter poles, shredded their only decent tarp with her claws during a frustration-induced partial transformation, and put a very inconvenient hole through their water purification tablets. "Don't blame me for your delicate vampire constitution," she continued, wringing out her sleeping bag with enough force to squeeze wine from grapes. "At least you don't have to deal with supernatural fur that takes literal weeks to properly dry. Do you see this?" She gestured at her damp hair. "This is my human hair. The fur underneath is basically a portable swamp at this point. I'm one frustration away from just shaving it all off and starting over." Smith Changeling, who'd never bothered with a last name since he could become literally anyone, was currently experiencing an identity crisis in the most literal sense possible. His shape-shifting abilities had become completely unreliable in the dampened supernatural environment. He'd intended to transform into a bloodhound to track their scent back to the trail, but instead had become what appeared to be a golden retriever with anxiety issues. His attempts to change back had resulted in a series of increasingly ridiculous forms: a duck with opposable thumbs, a bear with butterfly wings, and memorably, a tree that could walk but couldn't see where it was going. "This is a nightmare," he said, currently in human form but with visible scales on his neck, and what appeared to be gills behind his ears. Leftovers from his earlier attempt to become a fish to test the stream water for potability. "I've been every animal in the forest, and the bark pattern alone." "Oh, like you'd know," Vera exploded, her yellow eyes flashing dangerously. "You've spent the last 3 centuries living in penthouses and feeding from willing donors who think you're romantically mysterious. The closest you've come to nature is that artificial blood you drink when you're feeling eco-conscious." "That is completely unfair and historically inaccurate," Wesley protested, his aristocratic dignity warring with the reality that he currently looked like he'd lost a fight with a hedge. "I may prefer civilized accommodations, but I am still a creature of supernatural power. My night vision alone should be enough to—" "Your night vision couldn't find your own coffin if it had a GPS tracker and a neon sign," Smith interjected. He was attempting to use his partial transformation abilities to become something useful, but kept accidentally sprouting random animal parts. Currently, he had human arms, deer legs, and what appeared to be a beaver tail. "I've watched you walk into glass doors in broad moonlight." "That was one time, and the glass was very clean." Harriet stood up abruptly, her exhaustion and frustration finally boiling over. "You know what the real problem is here? None of you bothered to learn any actual survival skills, because you were all too busy being immortal and powerful. Well, congratulations. Being immortal means we get to suffer through this disaster for eternity, unless we find a way out. Don't lecture us about preparation, Miss. I don't need a compass because I can control the wind," Vera shot back. You're the one who insisted we take the scenic route through the supernatural preserve because you wanted to commune with ancient magical energies. Ancient magical energies that have clearly decided to commune right back by making our powers completely useless. Harriot's voice cracked with the strain of 7 days without a proper shower, decent food, or functional magic. The argument escalated when Smith, trying to gesture emphatically with his current deer-human hybrid arms, accidentally knocked over their last remaining water bottle. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either murder or complete emotional breakdown. That's it, Vera said, her voice deadly quiet. That was our last clean water. I didn't mean to, Smith began. You never mean to, Wesley snapped. But somehow, every single one of your helpful transformations makes our situation worse. The beaver dam that flooded our original campsite, the eagle attempt that ended with you crashing into the only tree with edible fruit, the tracking dog phase that led us in 3 complete circles. At least I'm trying. Smith's voice cracked, and suddenly his partial transformations stopped being random and started being defensive. Spines sprouted along his arms, his teeth became sharp, and his eyes shifted to predator slits. What exactly have you contributed, Wesley? Besides complaining and getting stuck in trees, I am providing leadership and strategic thinking. You're providing commentary and fashion disasters. Vera stepped between them, her own supernatural control slipping. Her fingernails had extended into claws, her canine teeth were becoming more pronounced, and a low growl was building in her chest. Both of you need to back down before I remind you why werewolves were feared long before vampires became trendy. Harriet, meanwhile, had begun muttering under her breath in what sounded like Latin mixed with several dead languages and some very creative profanity. The air around her was beginning to shimmer with frustrated magical energy that had nowhere to go. The next 3 days passed in a haze of increasingly desperate and ridiculous survival attempts, punctuated by arguments that revealed centuries of hidden grievances. Harriet's approach to fire-making had evolved from dignified magical attempts to what could only be described as ritualistic stick abuse. She'd taken to arranging stones in complex magical patterns, convinced that the right geometric configuration would somehow bypass whatever was blocking her pyromancy. When that failed, she tried threatening the wood, bargaining with it, and finally attempting to psychologically manipulate dry leaves into spontaneous combustion through sheer force of personality. Light, damn you, she commanded a particularly stubborn piece of birch bark. I have burned armies. I have reduced castles to ash. I will not be defeated by you. The birch bark, unimpressed by her credentials, remained unlit. Wesley had convinced himself that his vampiric heritage must include some instinctual hunting abilities that transcended his urban lifestyle. This theory had led to increasingly embarrassing encounters with the local wildlife. He'd attempted to mesmerize a rabbit, which had stared at him blankly before hopping away. He tried to intimidate a squirrel into submission, which had responded by throwing acorns at his head with surprising accuracy. His latest attempt at natural vampiric predation had involved stalking a deer for 2 hours, only to realize he'd been following a large dog that belonged to some distant campers. This is impossible, he declared, sitting dejectedly on a fallen log while nursing several new scratches. In the old days, hunting was supposed to be instinctual. Vampires were apex predators. In the old days, Vera pointed out, while attempting to fish with her bare hands. And probably had human servants who did your hunting for you. Face it, Wesley, you're about as naturally predatory as a house cat with anxiety issues. House cats are actually quite effective predators, Smith offered. He was currently stuck halfway between human and fish form, with scales on his arms and gills that were making breathing complicated. Maybe I should try becoming a house cat. No, the other 3 spoke in unison. Vera's approach to their situation was the most practical, which made it all the more frustrating when it failed spectacularly. Her supernatural strength and enhanced senses should have made her the natural leader in a survival situation. But the dampened magical environment had left her off balance and overly aggressive. She'd successfully caught 3 fish with her bare hands, only to accidentally crush them beyond edibility with her nervous strength. Her attempt to track their original path by scent had led them 5 miles in the wrong direction before she realized she'd been following her own scent trail from 2 days earlier. I can still smell everything, she explained through gritted teeth, but I can't process it properly. It's like having super hearing in a language you don't speak. I know there's information there, but it's all just... The group's frustration reached a boiling point when Smith, attempting to become a bird to scout their location, instead transformed into what appeared to be a small, flightless dragon. This isn't even a real animal, Harriet shrieked. How can you shapeshift into something that doesn't exist? I don't know, Smet wailed, breathing small puffs of steam from his snout. My powers are as confused as I am. Maybe I'm channeling some kind of ancestral memory from when dragons were real. Dragons were never real, Wesley said flatly. That's mythology. So are vampires technically, Vera pointed out. That's completely different. How is that different? Because I'm standing right here. By the 10th day, the group had fractured completely. What started as petty arguments about navigation had evolved into a full, supernatural Cold War, with each member convinced that the others were actively sabotaging their survival efforts. Harriet had established her own camp 30 yards from the others, where she'd been conducting increasingly elaborate magical experiments in an attempt to restore her powers. Her latest theory involved creating a sympathetic magical resonance by recreating famous spells using only natural materials. This had resulted in her section of the forest being decorated with stone circles, twig formations that looked like runic alphabets, and several small craters where her experiments had gone wrong in spectacular fashion. I don't need their help, she muttered to herself, carefully arranging pine cones in what she was convinced was a power-amplifying mandala. Witches are solitary practitioners by nature. I survived the Salem trials, the Inquisition, and that unfortunate incident with the werewolf pack in 1847. I can certainly survive a camping trip. Her latest experiment involved trying to brew a power restoration potion using only foraged ingredients and rainwater. The results were bubbling ominously in a makeshift cauldron, actually a dented camping pot, and giving off rainbow-colored steam that made nearby plants grow at an alarming rate. Wesley, meanwhile, had retreated into what he called tactical solitude, but looked more like vampiric sulking. He'd found a small cave and was attempting to wait out the situation with aristocratic dignity, sustained by his conviction that rescue would come eventually. His main activities consisted of writing increasingly dramatic diary entries on pieces of bark and practicing speeches he intended to give when they were eventually found. Day 10 of his supernatural catastrophe, he dictated to himself while scratching words into a piece of bark with a sharpened stick. The others have revealed themselves to be fundamentally unsuited to crisis leadership. When we are rescued, and we will be rescued, I shall have to seriously reconsider my choice of companions for future endeavors. He'd also been attempting to maintain vampiric standards by insisting on washing his face with dew every morning and trying to keep his hair styled despite the complete lack of mirrors, running water, or functional hair products. The results were more deranged aristocrat than mysterious creature of the night, but his commitment was admirable. Vera had gone in the opposite direction, embracing what she called primal werewolf instincts and what everyone else would have called barely controlled rage. She'd been practicing her transformation control by shifting partially between forms, resulting in her spending most of her time as a human-wolf hybrid that was perfectly adapted for hunting and survival, but terrible at everything else. This is what we were meant to be, she declared to the forest at large, her voice rough with the half-transformation. Not civilized, not domesticated, wild, free, hungry. Her hunting had actually become more successful in her hybrid form, but she'd also become increasingly territorial and aggressive. She'd marked several trees around her section of their makeshift camp with claw marks and was showing disturbing tendencies toward challenging random forest animals to dominance contests. Snit had perhaps adapted the best to their situation, but only because his shape-shifting chaos had finally found a useful outlet. Unable to maintain any single form for more than a few hours, he'd become a one-being ecosystem support system. He'd spent the morning as a bee to help pollinate Harriet's rapidly growing experimental garden, shifted to a beaver to repair the water collection system that Vera had accidentally destroyed during a territorial rage, and was currently attempting to become some kind of rescue bird to signal for help. Unfortunately, his attempts at bird forms kept resulting in creatures that were either flightless, extremely confused, or both. His latest attempt had produced what appeared to be a dodo with anxiety issues. I just want to go home, he said sadly, his voice muffled by his beak. I want to sleep in a bed that doesn't move, eat food that doesn't require me to catch it first, and maybe spend a few decades as something simple, like a houseplant. The breakthrough came not from any of their individual efforts, but from a completely unexpected source. Smith's complete inability to control his transformations finally revealed what was actually happening to them. It was day 12 when Smith, attempting to become something useful for the 100th time, transformed into something none of them had seen before. A creature that looked like a cross between a dowsing rod and a very nervous rabbit. But instead of being confused and useless like his other recent forms, This creature immediately began moving with purpose, its rod-like appendages pointing consistently in one direction, while making excited chirping sounds. "What are you now?" Vera called, temporarily abandoning her territorial marking to investigate. "I don't know," Smit chirped back, "but I think I'm detecting something supernatural, something big." Harriet emerged from her experimental grove, where her power restoration potion had just succeeded in turning a dead tree into what appeared to be a very large, very confused Venus flytrap. Supernatural how? Like, a lot of supernatural energy, all concentrated in one place, that way. Smit pointed with one of his dowsing rod appendages toward a ridge they hadn't yet explored. Wesley appeared from his cave, his diary bark clutched importantly in one hand. "Are you suggesting there's some kind of supernatural phenomenon interfering with our abilities?" "I'm suggesting," Smit said, his weird dowsing creature instincts overriding his usual confusion, "that we're not lost because we're incompetent. We're lost because something is actively messing with supernatural creatures in this entire area." The four of them stared at each other as the implications sank in. "So you mean," Harriet said slowly, "our powers aren't broken. They're being suppressed? And we're not terrible at survival," Vera added, her hybrid features shifting with hope. "We're being sabotaged by some kind of supernatural interference? Which would explain why my vampiric senses are blocked, why Harriet's magic keeps misfiring, why Vera's tracking abilities are scrambled, and why Smit keeps turning into things that don't exist," Wesley concluded, his aristocratic bearing returning as his dignity was restored. For the first time in days, they looked at each other without hostility. Their individual failures suddenly seemed less like personal inadequacies and more like symptoms of a larger problem. "I owe you all an apology," Harriet said quietly. "I blamed you for our situation when we were all victims of something beyond our control." "We all did," Vera admitted, her hybrid features softening. "I've been so frustrated with my own limitations that I took it out on everyone else. I may have been somewhat dramatic in my responses to our circumstances," Wesley conceded, "and possibly unfairly critical of everyone's survival attempts. And I definitely made things worse by panicking every time my shapes went wrong," Smit added, though it came out as a series of chirps that they all somehow understood. As they prepared to follow Smit's supernatural detection abilities toward whatever was causing their problems, the group's dynamic shifted completely. Instead of four desperate individuals struggling against each other, they were once again a team of supernatural beings. Following Smit's supernatural dowsing instincts, they climbed the ridge as the sun began to set on their 12th day in the wilderness. What they found at the top was so unexpected, so shocking, and so utterly mundane that it took them several minutes to process what they were seeing. A small, elderly human woman sat in a lawn chair next to a camping trailer, knitting what appeared to be a very long scarf. She was surrounded by the most aggressively normal camping setup any of them had ever seen: a Coleman tent, a portable barbecue, a folding table with a checkered tablecloth, and a small garden where she was growing what looked like perfectly ordinary vegetables. But the air around her campsite shimmered with suppressive magical energy so powerful that it made their dampened abilities feel like a gentle breeze in comparison. "Oh," the woman said cheerfully when she noticed them approaching. "More visitors. How wonderful. I don't get many supernatural folks up here during the suppression season." The four supernatural beings stared at her in complete bewilderment. "Suppression season?" Harriet finally managed to ask. "Oh yes, dear," the woman said, continuing her knitting without missing a stitch. "I'm Ethel Grimbaldi, Supernatural Wildlife Management Specialist. This is a designated supernatural regeneration zone. We suppress magical abilities for 2 weeks every season to prevent overhunting, territorial disputes, and excessive magical environmental damage. It's all perfectly legal. There are signs posted at every trail entrance." Wesley felt something cold and terrible settle in his stomach. "Signs?" "Oh yes, lots of them. Big, bright yellow ones that say entering supernatural regeneration zone. Magical abilities temporarily suppressed. Estimated duration 14 days. They're quite hard to miss, actually." Vera closed her eyes and took a deep, careful breath. "Smit," she said in a voice of terrifying calm, "mind me again what happened to the first sign we saw when we entered the preserve." Smit, still in his dowsing creature form, made a sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a chirp. When I was practicing my rhinoceros form, I may have charged through it." "And you didn't think to mention what it said?" "I was a rhinoceros. Rhinoceroses don't read signs." Ethel looked up from her knitting with grandmotherly interest. "Oh, you must be the group that's been causing all that commotion down in Sector 7. We've been monitoring your magical discharge patterns. Very entertaining. That exploding potion experiment yesterday registered on our sensors from 3 miles away. Harriet felt her eye begin to twitch. You've been monitoring us? Of course, dear. It's policy. We track all supernatural beings in the regeneration zone to make sure they don't hurt themselves or each other while their abilities are suppressed. You wouldn't believe some of the things we've seen. Vampires trying to climb trees, werewolves attempting to fish with their bare hands, shapeshifters turning into imaginary creatures. She paused and looked at Smit. Though that dowsing rabbit form is new, quite creative. Wesley sat down heavily on a nearby rock. So you're telling us that we spent nearly 2 weeks lost in the wilderness, fighting with each other, attempting to survive with medieval technology, and slowly losing our minds because Smit destroyed a sign he didn't bother to read? Well, Ethel said cheerfully, that and because none of you thought to check the Supernatural Recreation website before planning your trip. It's all clearly posted online. Dates, locations, temporary ability restrictions, emergency contact information, even suggestions for mortal-friendly camping gear. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Smit's dowsing creature form making small, guilt-ridden squeaking noises. However, Ethel continued, consulting a small calendar, you're in luck. The suppression period ends tomorrow at sunset. Your abilities should return gradually over the following 24 hours. And there's a perfectly good trail that leads straight back to the parking area. It's about a 2-mile hike from here. Vera opened her eyes and looked directly at Smit. 2 miles, she said with supernatural calm. We've been 2 miles from the exit for almost 2 weeks. In my defense, Smit squeaked, I was various confused animals for most of that time. The hike back to civilization was accomplished in record time, powered by a combination of determination, embarrassment, and the increasingly uncomfortable awareness that they would eventually have to tell this story to other supernatural beings. As they reached the parking area, which was exactly where they'd left it, clean and well-maintained and surrounded by multiple large, clear signs that they had somehow missed on their way in, their supernatural abilities began to return in a rush of familiar power. Harriet's magic came back first, flooding through her like a warm tide. She immediately used it to clean and dry their entire group, repair their damaged gear, and incinerate the remains of her failed experimental potions. There, she said with satisfaction. Now we look like supernatural beings again, instead of refugees from a natural disaster. Wesley's vampiric senses returned next, immediately informing him of everything he'd missed during their ordeal. The sense of nearby campers, the locations of multiple game trails they could have followed, and, embarrassingly, the fact that they had been within a quarter-mile of a ranger station for the last 3 days. Vera's werewolf abilities restored themselves with a satisfying rush of strength and sensory clarity. She could suddenly smell everything again, the trail markers they'd missed, the human-made path they'd been seeking, and the unmistakable scent of hot showers and real food from a nearby campground. Smith's shapeshifting stabilized last, allowing him to finally return to his preferred human form and stay there. I'm never becoming a rhinoceros again, he declared. Or any animal that can't read signs. As they loaded their gear into their cars, preparing to return to their respective supernatural lives, Ethel Grinbaldi appeared one last time, having apparently walked the 2 miles from her monitoring station to see them off. I hope you enjoyed your stay in our regeneration zone, she said pleasantly. We'd love to have you back, perhaps next time during our regular season when you can actually use your abilities for hiking and wildlife observation. Thank you, Harriet said with as much dignity as she could muster. But I think we've had enough wilderness adventure for several decades. Oh, one more thing, Ethel added, pulling out a small clipboard. Would you mind filling out our visitor satisfaction survey? We're always looking for ways to improve the supernatural recreation experience. 3 months later, the 4 supernatural beings met for their regular monthly dinner at Wesley's penthouse, an event that had taken on new significance since their wilderness disaster. I've been thinking, Harriet said, cutting into her perfectly prepared steak with a knife that gleamed with subtle magical enhancement, about what we learned from our experience. That we should always read signs, Snit suggested, though he was grinning as he said it. That supernatural beings are just as capable of spectacular stupidity as mortals, Vera offered, raising her wine glass in a mock toast. That pride goes before a fall, especially when that fall involves getting stuck in trees, Wesley added, his dignity now fully restored by 3 months of comfortable city living. All of that, Harriet agreed, but also that we're better friends than we are individual survivors. We may have spent 2 weeks making each other miserable, but we also spent 2 weeks refusing to give up on each other. Even when we wanted to, Vera admitted. Especially when we wanted to, Wesley corrected. Smith raised his glass. To supernatural friendship. May it survive future disasters with our dignity more intact than it survived the last one. To reading signs, Harriet added. To backup plans, Vera continued. To checking websites before making reservations, Wesley concluded. They clinked glasses and settled in for an evening of comfortable supernatural society, warm food, and the kind of friendship that can survive even the most ridiculous of shared disasters. Though they did all, independently and without discussing it, bookmark the Supernatural Recreation website in their phones. Just in case. 3 years later, a small plaque was installed at the entrance to the Carpathian Supernatural Recreation Area, reading, "In memory of 4 supernatural beings who spent 2 weeks proving that eternal life does not automatically confer wisdom, common sense, or basic map reading skills. Please read all signs carefully. The management." The plaque was removed after Harriet hexed it to display increasingly sarcastic messages. But the legend lives on in supernatural recreation circles as the great sign incident of the Carpathian Preserve.